In the grand and terrible tapestry of human history, few conflicts have been waged on a scale as vast, as brutal, or as consequential as the Great Patriotic War. This titanic struggle on the Eastern Front of World War II, a conflict that the Soviet Union fought for its very survival, has passed from memory into legend. Its glorious victory, however, was purchased at an almost unimaginable cost: the blood and sacrifice of tens of millions of Soviet citizens. This crucible of fire and ice became the pivotal turning point of the Second World War, a moment that not only halted the seemingly invincible Nazi war machine, but began the long, grinding process of pushing it back to the abyss of its own creation. To speak of the Great Patriotic War is to invoke the names of legendary battles that echo through the annals of military history. The defense of Leningrad, a city of ghosts that refused to die. The Battle of Kursk, the largest and most ferocious tank engagement ever witnessed. The apocalyptic street fighting in the ruins of Stalingrad, the symbolic death knell of the Third Reich. And the desperate, heroic defense of Moscow, where the Blitzkrieg was frozen in its tracks. Etched into the soul of each of these monumental victories is the indelible mark of one man. He was the Red Army's greatest commander, the master strategist and chief architect of its most sacred triumphs. He was the indispensable fireman whom Stalin dispatched to every collapsing front, the man whose iron will could turn rout into resistance and despair into defiance. His tactical genius was so profound, his presence so commanding, that even the paranoid and all-powerful Joseph Stalin, a man who trusted no one, held him in such awe that he reportedly hesitated to awaken the Marshal when he found him asleep. His name was Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, the greatest of the great commanders, the most renowned general among a pantheon of legendary generals. His military career was a saga that spanned one of the most tumultuous periods in Russian history, a journey from the twilight of the Tsars to the zenith of Soviet power. Zhukov's story did not begin in the halls of a privileged military academy, but in the humble poverty of a peasant village. Born in 1896 in Strelkovka, a small village in the Kaluga region, his world was one of dirt floors, hard labor, and the simple, unforgiving rhythms of rural Russian life. His destiny, however, would not be tied to the plow. In 1915, with the world engulfed in the fires of the First World War, Zhukov was conscripted into the army of the Russian Empire. It was here, in the cavalry of the Tsar, that the young man first tasted combat. He proved to be a natural soldier, brave, resourceful, and unflinching under fire. He was decorated twice with the Cross of St. George for his valor, a testament to the innate warrior spirit that lay within him. The cataclysm of 1917, the year of the Russian Revolution, shattered his world. The old empire collapsed, and from its ashes a new and radical power emerged. Like millions of others, Zhukov was faced with a choice. He cast his lot with the Bolsheviks, joining the ranks of the newly formed Red Army. It was this decision that set him upon the path to legend. During the brutal Russian Civil War that followed, Zhukov honed his skills as a cavalry commander. He was assigned to the 4th Regiment of the 1st Moscow Cavalry Division, and it was in this role that he developed a profound appreciation for the principles of speed, shock, and mobility. For Zhukov, the cavalry was more than just a branch of the army. It was, as he saw it, a form of military romance, a force of decisive action that could shatter an enemy's flank and turn the tide of battle in an instant. He fought with distinction, accumulating a string of victories and earning the respect of his superiors. After the war, he formally joined the Bolshevik Party, cementing his commitment to the Soviet state, and beginning the journey that would see him write some of the most glorious chapters in its history. Chapters sealed with victories over the armies of Nazi Germany. For 2 decades, Zhukov rose steadily through the ranks of the interwar Red Army. He was a diligent student of military science, absorbing the emerging theories of deep battle and combined arms warfare being pioneered by Soviet thinkers. Yet, for a commander of his potential, true greatness could only be forged in the crucible of high command. That crucible would be a remote and desolate stretch of the Mongolian border, in a battle that would serve as his enunciation, the moment his genius was revealed to the world. In May 1939, simmering tensions between the Soviet Union and the Empire of Japan exploded into open conflict along the Khalkhin Gol River. The Japanese Kwantung Army, aggressive and supremely confident, launched an armed incursion into the territory of the Mongolian People's Republic, a Soviet ally. The initial Soviet response was disorganized and ineffective, resulting in a series of humiliating setbacks. In Moscow, a furious Stalin needed a commander who could not only stabilize the front, but deliver a decisive and crushing blow. He chose Zhukov. Appointed commander of the 57th Special Corps, Zhukov arrived on the scene and immediately began to impose his iron will. He was appalled by the poor state of discipline and preparation. He quickly reorganized his forces, ruthlessly cashiering incompetent officers and demanding absolute precision in the execution of his orders. But his true brilliance lay in his operational vision. Zhukov understood that this was not a battle to be won with cavalry charges, but with the coordinated power of a modern, mechanized army. Over the next month, he orchestrated a masterful logistical buildup, secretly moving vast quantities of tanks, artillery, and aircraft across hundreds of miles of unforgiving terrain. He employed classic Soviet deception techniques, or maskirovka, broadcasting the sounds of construction to mislead Japanese intelligence about his intentions, while his real strike forces assembled in silence. His plan was a masterpiece of combined arms warfare, a textbook double envelopment designed not merely to push the Japanese back, but to encircle and annihilate them. On August 20, 1939, Zhukov unleashed his storm. Under the cover of a massive artillery barrage and overwhelming air superiority achieved by the Soviet Air Force, his armored wings slammed into the vulnerable Japanese flanks. 2 tank brigades and 2 mechanized brigades, composed of fast-moving BT tanks and armored cars, formed the mighty steel pincers of the Red Army. They punched through the Japanese lines, racing to meet behind the enemy, trapping the entire Japanese 6th Army. The Japanese, whose doctrine was built on warrior spirit and infantry assaults, were utterly unprepared for this symphony of industrial violence. By August 31st, just 11 days after the offensive began, the battle was over. The Japanese Kwantung Army had suffered a catastrophic defeat, with tens of thousands of casualties. Zhukov had delivered a victory of stunning decisiveness. The Battle of Khalkhin Gol was far more than a simple border skirmish. It was a strategic masterclass. Here, Zhukov tested and perfected the very tactics, the massed use of armor, deep penetration, air support, and encirclement that the Red Army would later use to dismember the German Wehrmacht. His operational methods bore a striking resemblance to the German Blitzkrieg, demonstrating a shared understanding of modern mobile warfare. This victory had profound geopolitical consequences, convincing Tokyo to abandon its northern ambitions and instead look south towards the Pacific, thereby ensuring the Soviet Union would not have to fight a two-front war in 1941. Zhukov's strategic foresight was, it seems, a once-in-a-generation talent. He returned to Moscow a hero, his reputation as a brilliant and ruthless commander firmly established. By the autumn of 1940,
The shadow of Nazi Germany loomed large over Europe. The Wehrmacht had crushed Poland, France, and the Low Countries, leaving only Great Britain defiant. The Soviet Union, protected by the fragile shield of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, stood as the last great land power on the continent. Zhukov, now chief of the General Staff of the Red Army, understood the existential threat better than most. He knew that the Nazi ideology of Lebensraum, living space, made a clash with the Soviet Union not a matter of if, but when. He recognized that if the last bastion of socialism were to fall, the world would be plunged into an age of unparalleled darkness. Working tirelessly, Zhukov oversaw a series of large-scale war games and exercises designed to prepare the Red Army for a German invasion. He argued passionately for the modernization of the armed forces, particularly for the creation of large, independent tank corps capable of meeting the German panzers on equal terms. His strategic vision was remarkably prescient. He foresaw a war of unprecedented scale and mobility, one where victory would depend on the seamless integration of tanks, aircraft, artillery, and infantry. Tragically, many of his most urgent proposals were ignored or diluted by a military bureaucracy still steeped in outdated doctrines and by a political leadership, led by Stalin, that was desperately clinging to the hope that war could be avoided. The purges of the 1930s had decapitated the Red Army's officer corps, replacing experienced commanders with politically reliable but often incompetent loyalists. Zhukov's warnings were dismissed as alarmist. On June 22, 1941, his worst fears were realized. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history, was unleashed. The Wehrmacht smashed across the border, its Blitzkrieg tactics tearing through the unprepared and poorly led Soviet defenses. In the opening weeks of the war, the Red Army suffered a series of disasters on a scale unseen in modern warfare. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were encircled and captured. Thousands of aircraft were destroyed on the ground, and vast swaths of Soviet territory were overrun. The Soviet Union teetered on the brink of total collapse. In this moment of supreme crisis, Zhukov became Stalin's indispensable problem solver. Stripped from his position as chief of staff after a heated argument with Stalin, he was immediately sent as a representative of the High Command, Stavka, to the most critical sectors of the front. He was a human buttress, a force of pure will sent to shore up crumbling defenses and organize desperate counterattacks. He rushed to the southwestern front, then to Leningrad, where his brutal and uncompromising methods helped to stabilize the city's defenses just as the German noose was tightening. He demanded sacrifice, he executed shirkers, and he worked himself and his staff to the point of exhaustion, but he got results. Where Zhukov went, the line somehow held.
By the autumn of 1941, the German war machine had reached the gates of Moscow. Operation Typhoon, the final great push to capture the Soviet capital, was underway. The situation was catastrophic. Multiple Soviet armies had been encircled and destroyed near Vyazma and Bryansk, leaving the road to Moscow wide open. Panic gripped the city. Government ministries were being evacuated, and the specter of Hitler's armies marching through Red Square seemed a terrifyingly real possibility. On October 10, Zhukov was recalled from Leningrad and given command of the Western Front, tasked with the seemingly impossible mission of saving the capital. What he found was a front in utter disarray, but where others saw only chaos, Zhukov saw the raw materials for a defense. He immediately set about constructing a new defensive line, a series of fortified zones built in concentric rings around the city. He pulled together every available unit, shattered remnants of defeated armies, raw militia divisions, officer cadets from military schools, and threw them into the breach. His leadership was electrifying and terrifying in equal measure. He was a whirlwind of energy, driving across the front in his staff car, appearing at the most critical points to rally his men and berate his commanders. He embodied the spirit of not one step back, long before it became official doctrine. His orders were simple and brutal. Hold your ground or be shot. Zhukov's strategy was to trade space for time, to bleed the German offensive white through a defense in depth. He identified the main German armored thrusts and concentrated his anti-tank artillery and reserves to meet them. As the autumn rains turned the roads to impassable mud, the German advance slowed to a crawl. Then came the true savior of Moscow, the Russian winter. Temperatures plummeted to levels the ill-equipped German soldiers were wholly unprepared for. Engines froze, weapons jammed, and frostbite took a terrible toll. Just as the German offensive reached its climax, with some panzer spearheads reportedly able to see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars, Zhukov unleashed his masterstroke. Throughout the autumn, Stalin, on Zhukov's assurance, had been transferring fresh, fully equipped winter-hardened divisions from Siberia and the Far East. These were the troops that had been guarding against a Japanese attack that, thanks to Zhukov's victory at Khalkhin Gol 2 years earlier, never came. On December 5, 1941, Zhukov launched a massive counteroffensive. The exhausted, frozen Germans were taken completely by surprise. All along the front, the Red Army attacked, pushing the Wehrmacht back from the capital. It was not a war-winning victory, but its psychological impact was immeasurable. For the first time in World War II, the German army had been dealt a major strategic defeat. The myth of its invincibility was shattered in the snows outside Moscow. The city was saved, and with it, the Soviet Union. Zhukov, the hero of Khalkhin Gol, was now hailed as the savior of Moscow. The defeat at Moscow forced Hitler to change his strategy. In the summer of 1942, he launched a new offensive, not against the capital, but south, towards the oil fields of the Caucasus and the industrial city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. If this city, bearing Stalin's own name, were to fall, the Soviet war effort would be crippled. By August 1942, Zhukov had been appointed Deputy Supreme Commander, second only to Stalin himself. He was immediately dispatched to the Stalingrad front, where the situation was once again dire. The German Sixth Army, a veteran force, was battering the city's defenders, while the Luftwaffe relentlessly bombed it into a smoldering ruin. Zhukov, a man whose natural inclination was always to attack, initially attempted a series of hasty counteroffensives to relieve the pressure on the city. These attacks, launched with insufficient preparation against an enemy that still held the advantage, were costly failures. Zhukov would later admit this was one of the greatest mistakes of his career. He learned a bitter lesson. Will alone was not enough. Victory required patience, planning, and overwhelming force applied at the decisive point. He withdrew to Stavka headquarters and, alongside the brilliant Chief of Staff, General Alexander Vasilevsky, began to craft a new plan. The two men were a perfect command team. Zhukov, the fiery, intuitive operational artist, and Vasilevsky, the calm, meticulous planner. For 2 months they worked in absolute secrecy, poring over maps and intelligence reports, orchestrating one of the most ambitious and audacious counteroffensives in military history. The plan was given the codename Operation Uranus. The concept was pure Zhukov, reminiscent of his triumph at Khalkhin Gol, but on an infinitely grander scale.
He observed that while the German Sixth Army, battering Stalingrad, was an elite force, its flanks, stretching for hundreds of kilometers across the open steppe, were held by much weaker Romanian and Italian armies. These were to be the targets. While General Vasily Chukov's 62nd Army bled the Germans white in the nightmarish street fighting of the city itself, a battle for every building, every room, every pile of rubble, Zhukov secretly amassed immense Soviet armies on the flanks. On November 19, 1942, in the midst of a blinding snowstorm, Operation Uranus was launched. Two massive Soviet pincers smashed through the Romanian positions north and south of Stalingrad. The Soviet Tank Corps, now operating with a skill and confidence that would have been unimaginable a year earlier, drove deep into the German rear. 4 days later, the two pincers met at the town of Khalkhin, snapping the trap shut. The entire German Sixth Army, nearly 300,000 men under the command of General Friedrich Paulus, was encircled. The ensuing Battle of the Kessel, or Cauldron, was an epic of starvation, freezing, and attrition. A German relief attempt, Operation Winter Storm, was beaten back. The Luftwaffe's promised air bridge failed. On February 2, 1943, the starving remnants of the Sixth Army surrendered. The victory at Stalingrad was the definitive turning point of the Second World War. It was a military catastrophe for Germany from which it would never recover. The psychological blow was even greater. The entire world now knew that the Third Reich could be and would be defeated. Zhukov, the co-architect of this monumental victory, had ascended into the pantheon of history's greatest military commanders.
Following Stalingrad, the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front passed permanently to the Red Army. In the summer of 1943, Hitler made one last great gamble to regain it. He planned a massive pincer offensive, codenamed Operation Citadel, to cut off a large Soviet salient around the city of Kursk. This would lead to the largest tank battle in history. The Soviet High Command, through excellent intelligence, knew exactly what the Germans were planning. A debate raged within Stavka. Should they launch a preemptive strike, or should they absorb the German attack and then counterpunch? It was Zhukov who forcefully argued for the latter. He proposed to let the Germans smash themselves against an impenetrable, multi-layered defense, to bleed their precious panzer divisions dry, and only then to unleash the full might of the Soviet reserves. His plan was adopted. The Red Army constructed the most formidable defensive network the world had ever seen. Hundreds of miles of trenches, vast minefields with a density of thousands of mines per square mile, and an unprecedented concentration of anti-tank guns. When the German offensive began on July 5, 1943, it ran into a wall of fire and steel. The climactic engagement at the village of Prokhorovka saw over 1,000 tanks clash at point-blank range in a hellish maelstrom of smoke and exploding metal. The German offensive exhausted itself. Its armored spearheads were shattered. Then, just as Zhukov had planned, the Red Army launched its own massive counteroffensives, breaking through the German lines and liberating vast territories. The Battle of Kursk was the death knell of the German Panzerwaffe. From that point forward, the war on the Eastern Front was a relentless Soviet advance. Zhukov was at the forefront of this advance. He coordinated the massive offensives that liberated Ukraine and Belarusia, most notably Operation Bagration in 1944, a stunning victory that annihilated German Army Group Center. He was the man who led the final, brutal assault on Berlin in April 1945. And on the night of May 8, 1945, it was Marshal Georgy Zhukov who stood in Berlin and accepted the unconditional surrender of the German High Command on behalf of the Soviet Union. The peasant boy from Strokovka had become the conqueror of the Third Reich.
One might assume that the man hailed as the Marshal of Victory would be showered with honors and hold a preeminent place in the post-war Soviet state. But in the paranoid world of Stalin's Kremlin, no one was safe, especially not a man as popular and powerful as Zhukov. His very success made him a threat. Stalin, pathologically jealous of any potential rival, saw in Zhukov a Bonaparte, a military hero who might harbor political ambitions. The secret police chief Lavrenti Beria and other rivals in the military and Politburo fanned the flames of Stalin's suspicion. In 1946, the persecution began. Zhukov was accused of a litany of fabricated crimes, exaggerating his own role in the war while diminishing Stalin's, illegally seizing trophies from Germany for his personal use, and harboring anti-Soviet sentiments. In a humiliating session of the High Military Council, he was denounced by his former comrades. He was stripped of his position as Commander-in-Chief of Soviet ground forces and effectively exiled, sent to command the obscure Odessa Military District and later the even more remote Urals District. The greatest soldier of his generation was cast into the political wilderness. The death of Stalin in 1953 offered a brief reprieve. In the ensuing power struggle, Nikita Khrushchev and other leaders needed the army support to remove the universally feared Beria. They turned to Zhukov. The Marshal, with his immense authority within the military, played a key role in orchestrating Beria's arrest. As a reward, he was brought back to the center of power, eventually becoming Minister of Defense. For a few years, it seemed his star was rising once more. He oversaw the modernization of the Soviet military for the nuclear age and played a crucial role in suppressing the Hungarian uprising in 1956. But history repeated itself. Khrushchev, like Stalin before him, grew wary of Zhukov's immense popularity and influence. In 1957, while Zhukov was on a state visit to Yugoslavia, he was unceremoniously dismissed from his post and forced into retirement, accused of fostering his own cult of personality. This time, the exile was final.
Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov spent the rest of his life in forced obscurity, living quietly in his dacha outside Moscow, writing his memoirs, reminiscences and reflections, which were heavily censored by the state before their publication. He died on June 18, 1974. His heart, the heart of a lion that had withstood the fury of the Wehrmacht, finally gave out. His funeral was a major state affair. He was buried with full military honors in the Kremlin Wall necropolis, his ashes interred alongside the other great heroes of the Soviet Union. Hundreds of thousands of ordinary citizens lined the streets to pay their last respects, a final testament to the deep and abiding place he held in the hearts of his people. Today, Zhukov's legacy remains as immense and complex as the man himself. He was, without question, one of the finest military commanders of the 20th century. His mastery of operational art, his strategic vision, and his unyielding will were instrumental in the defeat of Nazi Germany. He was ruthless, demanding, and often profligate with the lives of his men, a true product of the brutal system he served. Yet, he delivered victory when the alternative was enslavement and annihilation. He could defeat the most powerful army on earth, but he could not overcome the treacherous politics of the Kremlin. His life was a profound epic of triumph and tragedy, a story of a peasant's son who rose to save his nation, only to be cast aside by the very regime he had protected. He remains, for Russia and for the world, the enduring symbol of victory in the most terrible war in human history, the one and only Marshal of victory.